Good day. Before I proceed with this program, there is an announcement that I need to make, a brief announcement. Those of you who follow my colleague Alex Christoforou and watch us on the Duran will notice that his channel isn't publishing content at the present time, and that he isn't appearing on the Duran and is unlikely to do so for around a week. Now, I'm not going to discuss in detail the reasons for this. All I would say that it relates to something which took place in one of his videos, something that was said in one of his videos 1.5 years ago, or so we are told. Now, as I said, I'm not going to discuss this issue on this program. All I would say is that we are, of course, always grateful to YouTube for offering us a platform. It is always a reminder when these things happen that which is given can always be taken away. Alex remains busy with his work, as always. If you want to see his content, please remember that you can find all of the content that both of us produce on Locals and on Rumble and on ODYSEE and on Telegram. Locals is perhaps our main alternative platform. Rumble is also becoming important, increasingly important. Of course, Locals and Rumble are connected with each other, and our Telegram channel is also growing fast. So if you want to keep yourself informed with all the things that Alex is saying and doing, you can go to these other platforms, especially Locals and Rumble and Telegram, and you can keep track with it there also. Lastly, and I have to say this, I repeat my point, that which is given can always be taken away and can all happen with very little notice. You want to be sure of getting all our content at all times, then of course if you subscribe on Locals and you'll find the links under this video, well then you are absolutely sure of getting our content, whatever happens to us elsewhere. Anyway, I think I should now proceed with the content of this program. And again, and inevitably and unavoidably, I am returning to the situation in Ukraine. And can I say that in making this program today, I'm extremely grateful to Gonzalo Lira and to the person I know as Dima. Dima being the person who is behind, who produces the Military Summary channel, which to my knowledge is followed by lots of people interested in the ongoing events in Ukraine, the military side of events in Ukraine. It is he who provides us, all of us, with a day-to-day, almost sometimes hour by hour, it feels, account of the latest military developments. And it was a great privilege to host Dima and Gonzalo on a live show on the Duran, and I am happy to confess my debt to Dima in my understanding of the war, because as I so often repeat and say on so many programs, I am not a military man. Now, having said this, I'm going to return to some of the points that were raised over the course of the live stream, over the course of this program. And the first thing I think to say is that the tempo of the war in Donbass, the scale and intensity of the Russian offensive in Donbass is now once more intensifying. And yesterday on the Military Summary channel, we learned about how there's now been relentless Russian artillery strikes on various Ukrainian military formations in northern Donetsk region, with the Russians carrying out powerful strikes against all of these, several of these military formations as they shape the battlefield, capturing also towns and small towns and villages and settlements as they gradually tighten the web around these important places that they're seeking to capture. Siversk in northern Donetsk and Bakhmut a little further south. And I think it's looking increasingly as if the pattern of earlier battles in Donbass is now repeating himself. Incredibly heavy Russian artillery strikes, relentless, very focused, very concentrated, causing terrible destruction. Dima told us of an absolutely chilling piece of information he was given, that the smell of burning human bodies can be detected sometimes miles away from the battlefronts as a result of this cascade of bombs and shells and missiles and rockets and ammunition that the Russians pile upon these unhappy Ukrainian troops who are caught in this, what a Ukrainian official has himself referred to as a living hell. And this has been the pattern earlier in the war. It was what led to the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in places like Popasnaya, Liman, and it's now happened, and then in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and it's now happening again around Siversk and Bakhmut. And I have to say that, putting aside all considerations of geopolitics, one feels terrible anguish for these people, these men, these human beings who are trapped under this terrible shelling. And like Dima, I so wish that this horror would stop. But we have to be analytical on these programs, otherwise ultimately what's the point in them? And it's clear to me that once again a significant part of the Ukrainian army, many of Ukraine's best and bravest troops, are once again dying, often in horrible circumstances, trying to defend these towns, Siversk and Bakhmut, that are now Ukraine's main fortresses, if you like, in northern Donetsk region. And of course, once these two towns fall, which all the indications are they eventually will, then there will be the further final culminating battle. And Dima suggested, and by the way, I suspect he's probably right, I'm hearing more and more people say this, that the Ukrainians are unlikely to put up much of a defense in Slavyansk, which is apparently rather difficult to defend because of its geography, its topography, and that the last big stand by the Ukrainian army in Donbass will be in the town of Kramatorsk. And again, I would say that the logic of this, to me at least, remains difficult to understand. I've heard lots of explanations. I get back to that all shortly. It seems to me that it makes little sense to sacrifice the best part of your army to try to defend Donbass, even allowing it to be destroyed, allowing all these brave men, some young, some no longer quite so young, to sacrifice them in what seems to me a futile effort to hold on to places like Siversk and Bakhmut, which, whatever their tactical importance, are hardly major cities. They're not Kharkiv or Zaporozhye or Odessa, if even those places should be defended. But that, it seems to me, is what is now clearly happening in Donbass. Now, over the course of our live stream with him, Dima made this point, and he also discussed this in Military Summary Channel. It's actually very difficult for Ukraine to replace these forces that are being destroyed in northern Donbass. in northern Donetsk. The reason is because the communications, the railway links to Donetsk region are now becoming increasingly fragile. Now, it seems to me this has been true, actually, for a large part of this war. If you take your mind back a couple of months when the war started, in those days, I myself, like several other people, was talking about the Ukrainian army in Donbass being essentially completely cut off from the rest of Ukraine. Well, that wasn't correct. It never became completely and entirely cut off in that way. But it's clear that most of the major communications lines have been badly disrupted, and that it's been increasingly difficult for Ukraine to send large reinforcements to Donbass. That it has repeatedly tried, and it also repeatedly tried to launch counteroffensives against the large Russian grouping in ETHEREUM, all of which attempts have failed. Further south in southern Donetsk region, it's still easier, apparently, for the Ukrainians to send reinforcements and weapon systems and equipment through the city of Zaporozhye, the major city of Zaporozhye, to the Ukrainian forces that are still based opposite the Russian-controlled or Russian-allied-controlled city of Donetsk in southern Donbass. And so that means that these forces of Ukraine, these Ukrainian forces in northern Donetsk region, those forces that are trying to defend Siversk and Bakhmut and Slavyansk, as they're gradually ground down, and Dima's calculations for some of their losses, or rather I should say the Russian calculations for some of their losses, are simply horrendous, 60 to 80% of effectives, which seems astonishing to me. Well, as these forces are ground down, it's becoming increasingly difficult to replace them. So inexorably, irresistibly, this mighty Russian force, under this cover of this vast artillery barrage that it propels in, before it captures town after town, village after village, settlement after settlement, city after city in Donbass. And it seems that there's nothing that Ukraine can do which can stop it eventually taking or bringing the entirety of Donbass under Russian control. And for the record, I don't think there's anything Ukraine will ever be able to do to push the Russians out of this area of Donbass. Now, I'm going to say something else, which is that one of the other features of this war, which we didn't discuss with Dima, but which is now starting to trickle through from various other sources, is that as Ukrainian fighting power in Donbass it starts to dwindle, or is dwindling, and is actually dwindling rapidly as Ukraine suffers more and more losses, and as such troops as can be sent to reinforce the Ukrainian forces there become increasingly ill-trained and ill-equipped. As Ukrainian forces dwindle, Russia is now steadily reinforcing its forces in Donbass. We're getting increasing reports, and these seem to be confirmed reports, that there's now a steady trickle of battalion tactical groups, Russian battalion tactical groups, heading towards Donbass. Now, earlier in this war, the Ukrainians perhaps actually physically outnumbered the Russians in Donbass. And some time ago, not very long ago, in terms of absolute raw numbers of men, it became roughly even. Now it seems that the Russians may actually, for the first time, have numerical superiority in Donbass. Now that, it seems to me, is important because it means that the Russians can now attack simultaneously along several axes, and it becomes more difficult for the Ukrainians to shuttle reinforcements around from one point that's under attack to another. If they withdraw forces from one place, in order to defend another place, then they risk a stronger Russian attack on the place that they've withdrawn from. And we can already see this happening in a number of places. It seems that in order to defend Bakhmut, for example, the Ukrainians have had to pull back troops away from the defense of Siversk, so that Siversk that way starts to become more vulnerable. And if we're talking about the larger war, it also seems increasingly as if Ukraine has had to pull increasing numbers of troops back from defending Kharkiv to trying to hold the line in Donbass, though at the moment there are also reports that Ukraine is trying to send troops from further west in Ukraine back to Kharkiv to try to hold the line there. But the fact that we now have a situation where the Russians don't just outnumber Ukraine, the Ukrainian army in Donbass, in terms of tanks and machines and above all artillery, but also in men, must accelerate the moment of final collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Donbass. This has been a slow motion battle because it's taken so much of the appearance of a war of attrition. But we're now, it seems to me, reaching that inflection point where attrition tells, and tells decisively, and where, with larger numbers of troops than the Ukrainians have, at least in Donbass, and these are trained professional troops as opposed to the conscript troops that Ukraine largely fields. With more of these troops, the moment must surely soon come when it will no longer be possible for Ukraine to continue to resist in Donbass in the way that it has been doing up to now. Now, that begs the question of what Ukraine intends to do in this kind of situation. And there's been, again, a great deal of discussion about Ukraine's intentions of organizing some great offensive in southern Ukraine, again, in Kherson region. And Dima, again, in the Military Summary Channel, the last program that he did, pointed out that there's a very large concentration of Ukrainian troops west of the Dnieper River. They're having difficulties crossing the Dnieper River. They're not able to move all the way to Donbass, or they have problems doing so. And they're being increasingly concentrated in southwest Ukraine, where all the indications are that sooner or later Ukraine is going to try to launch a counteroffensive. Now, we've been hearing about this counteroffensive for months. The Ukrainians first started talking of a counteroffensive against Kherson region way back in March, in the middle of March. And there have been, as I've said on several programs, repeated attempts by the Ukrainian military to launch counteroffensives against Kherson region, against the Russians south of Zaporozhye, and each and every one of these attempts has ended in failure. Not just in failure, but in disastrous failure. Now, Ukraine is now talking about putting together a 1 million-man army equipped with Western weapons to carry out this offensive in a few days, weeks, next month. Nobody seems to quite know when. But I'm going to make a few quick observations about this. 1 million men is not, I think, a practical proposition for a country like Ukraine. Putting aside the question of how one trains and equips a force of that size, the logistical effort for a country like Ukraine, whose economy is now in severe straits, the logistical effort for Ukraine to keep an army of that scale in combat is going to be, I think, unbearable. I appreciate that Ukraine is getting aid from the West, mainly financial aid, but that can only go so far. You need to provide these troops with equipment, with food, with fuel, with ammunition, with all kinds of things. Modern armies, even modern armies working on a skeleton basis, require an enormous logistics tail. And a country like Ukraine is not going to be in a position, it seems to me, to sustain an army on that scale for very long. To be entirely frank, I think that whilst perhaps there are 700,000 people under arms across the whole entirety of Ukraine, I think Ukraine can just about keep them all together because they're all scattered in so many different places. They're all concentrated in one place, or if most of them were, or even a large proportion of them were, in a place like Donbass, or perhaps more practically opposite Kherson near Nikolaev. The logistics of this would be almost unbearable. It was something that the Soviet Union and Germany could do during the Second World War, that the Allies could do then. But of course, in those days, the industrial capacities of all of these powers that I've just mentioned are far greater than those of Ukraine today. And that isn't even beginning to take into account the enormous damage that Ukraine's entire industrial infrastructure, its road and railway network have all experienced. So I have, obvious skepticism about this million-man army that's going to capture Kherson region. This is drawn directly from my own experience, which did involve quite a lot of logistics. I mean, the staff work, the organization, the complexities of supply, I think are beyond the resources of Ukraine, especially of a Ukraine at war. But of course, you perhaps don't need a million-man army to carry out an offensive against Kherson. And I'm sure that when the offensive does take place, Ukraine will certainly deploy large numbers of troops, but I can't imagine it will be up to 1 million. But then we come up against this very strange fact, which is that Ukraine is now becoming increasingly desperate, or so it looks to me, in its recruitment methods. And there's been a very interesting article about this in, of all places, the Daily Mail, which a British newspaper, very mainstream newspaper, strong supporter of our still current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And it's published a piece about how Ukraine is now seizing men on beaches. It's sifting everywhere that it can to find men whom we can conscript into the army and throw into the battle. And of course, it's also recruiting women. And again, Dima from the Military Summary Channel has made the entirely valid point that women are capable fighters. If they're trained to be fighters, they can use weapons, they can do many of the things that men can do in battle. Perhaps they could do all the things that men can do in battle. But against that, I have to say that recruiting young women into the military is going to do at least two things if one leaves aside other considerations. Firstly, it's going to severely disrupt the operations of what's left of the civilian economy, which is surely becoming increasingly dependent on women to keep it functioning, as the men increasingly have been called up. And secondly, of course, it is bound to have a major psychological effect on Ukrainian society. The fact that women are being called up to the war that they're being mobilized, perhaps even forcibly conscripted. The Daily Mail did suggest that some of this conscription that's taken place in Ukraine is forced, that women are now being conscripted to fight in the war. It's difficult to know quite what effect it's going to have on Ukrainian society. Perhaps it might conceivably inspire it. It might make Ukrainians feel that even the women are now taking up arms to defend the nation. But I have to say, I think more likely, much more likely, it's going to intensify a mood of demoralization and depression, and strengthen the feeling that the death toll of Ukrainian soldiers in eastern Ukraine and across the war is becoming utterly devastating, and it will make more and more Ukrainians anxious to keep out of the war in order to preserve their lives. So that's what I would say about that. Now, there have been some other developments, and there's been a huge amount of discussion about the HIMARS systems and their overall effectiveness. And in my previous program, I said a few things about the HIMARS, how they've been successfully used, or apparently have been used successfully by the Ukrainians in carrying out certain strikes, and how the Russians are having to think hard about how to address the problems that the HIMARS systems are creating. And I did express a certain caution against assuming that these weapons are invulnerable. I said that I was sure that the Russians would be able to find methods to counter them before very long. One thing I didn't know when I made that program yesterday is that nearly all the reporting about the HIMARS that has been circulating, and which has been picked up, by the way, by parts of the Western media, seems to have passed through a blog of an individual called Igor Strelkov. Now, Igor Strelkov is his name, the name he's given in Russia and amongst Russians. The Ukrainians refer to him as Igor Girkin. I'm not going to discuss which is his real name and which is not, because I don't truly know. But all I would say is this. Strelkov, as I will call him, was a major leader of the insurgency in Donbass against the Maidan-installed Ukrainian government in 2014. However, he fell out with most of the local commanders, and though by universal acknowledgement he's an extremely brave man and a very talented commander, eventually both the local commanders, the local Donbass commanders, and the Russians got fed up with him, and he was forced to resign, and now finds himself in Russia, and he's not being allowed, obviously to his intense frustration, to participate in the fighting. And what he does instead is he provides a commentary about what is going on for his many, many millions of Russian readers. Now, this commentary is both supportive of the war and intensely critical of the Russian government. And a lot of people say that it is intensely critical, that it has a sort of doom-laden approach, that, he supports the war, but he thinks the war could be won and ought to be won if his advice basically was followed. He's very unsparing in his criticism of what is happening, what the Russian military is doing on the battlefield. Now, I'm far from being in a position to second guess many of his criticisms, some of which may be very valid, but all I would say is that any account of the effectiveness of the HIMARS systems that passes through Strelkov, or which comes from Strelkov, must be treated with some care because of Strelkov's particular views, both about the war and about the Russian military and about Putin's government. Now, there has been some information now about the HIMARS, and this is, I think, fairly well confirmed. In fact, I think it's in fact conclusive, which is that the Russians have now released photographs of a HIMARS shell, which they say, or missile, which was shot down by a Panzer, a Russian Panzer anti-aircraft and anti-missile system. Now that confirms that HIMARS missiles can be shot down by the Russian air defense system. And apparently what we are hearing is that what we're learning, what we've been told, is that the Ukrainians have indeed had some success using the HIMARS, though not on anything like the kind of scale that would be necessary to make any real dent in this remorseless Russian advance that we're hearing about. But anyway, it does seem that that the Ukrainians have been using the HIMARS with some success, and that the way that they do it, because they know that the missiles can be shot down by the Russians, is that instead of launching one HIMARS missile by itself, or perhaps one or two, they combine the HIMARS with Ukrainian multiple rocket launch systems. The Ukrainians fire 20, 30 rockets. The Russians shoot those rockets down. And whilst the Russian air defense systems are reloading, the HIMARS system, the HIMARS missile, is launched and is able to get through. So this has been the Ukrainian tactic up to now. Well, it's one that the Russians have figured out, and it points, I think, to what the Russians, one of the things that the Russians are going to do, because obviously their first line of defense against the HIMARS systems, their most obvious line of defense, the one that they're certain to follow, surely, is to beef up their air defenses, to develop their air defense systems in Ukraine and in Western Russia to counter these HIMARS. Now, that may sound complicated, but there's only so many targets that it would be useful to use these HIMARS missiles against. And so it's not perhaps difficult to keep large numbers of air defense systems to defend these important targets. The Crimean Bridge, by the way, is an obvious one. And once the Ukrainian rockets are launched and are all shot down, some Russian systems will be kept in reserve to deal with the HIMARS systems. And that seems to me, I mean, I'm not a military person, but that seems to me to be an obvious defense to these HIMARS systems. The other obvious solution is to track them all down and to destroy them. And this may explain this rather strange story that we've been hearing about Russia buying hundreds of drones from Iran. Now, Iran does produce drones, and some of them are very sophisticated. Some of them are reverse engineered drones. They've been reverse engineered from American drones, which Iran has itself captured. And Iran does field drones and has used them very effectively, and it does have drones which are able to launch bombs and missiles in the same way that American drones like the Predator do. So Iran does indeed have a drone capability. However, I have to say that I agree with the Moon of Alabama that Iran simply doesn't have, or so it seems to me, the kind of surge production capability to produce these hundreds of drones that is being talked about. Now, this whole story came from Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor. He said that Iran is going to be supplying Russia with hundreds of drones. And I think that this is a misleading story, and I think it probably has two kernels of truth. Firstly, what is clear is that Russia is ramping up very heavily its own drone production. Now, Russia came very late to the game of building drones. The Russian military took a very, very long time to settle on the kind of drones it wanted and to agree on particular types of drones and to put them into production in large numbers. One of the reasons, by the way, why production of Russian drones has lagged is because the Russian military insisted that all components had to be Russian designed and Russian made. That, by the way, includes the microchips, but it also includes the engines. Every aspect of these drones must be made in Russia. Well, that protracted the drone program. Turkish drones, even Iranian drones, use imported technologies. So the Russians, by deciding to use only their own technology, not even technology from China, obviously protracted, delayed their own program. But about a year ago, it all finally got ironed out. They got drones which work. They have their proper computer chips. They have their own aircraft. There are drones like the Orion and the Sirius, which they are now able to produce. They're the kind of drones that the United States has fielded, similar sorts of drones to those of the United States, and the Russians are now able to field them. And they got a factory that in December finally came into operation and started to make them in quantity. But as anybody knows, when a factory starts producing something, the initial batches are slow, because if you are setting up a factory, then of course you've got to sort out all the teething problems or the various problems of your subcomponents, sub-suppliers. You have to iron all of that out before you can start to produce your product in large serial quantities. Now, at the end of June, we got information that the Kronstadt factory, which is the main producer of the Orion and Sirius drones, Orion being the major drone that's being produced at the moment. The Sirius is a bigger drone that's perhaps a little way off from immediate production. But that factory, the Kronstadt factory, has finally got into full gear. So it is likely that over the next few weeks and months, we're going to see large numbers of drones appearing, Russian drones appearing over Ukraine. Now, drones are no more a game changer than any other weapon. But there's large numbers of drones operating over Ukraine, keeping an eye on what's going on. Drones are difficult to track with radars. They're not impossible, but they're a challenge for radars to track. And of course, any Ukrainian radar that tries to keep track on drones risks itself becoming a target. Its radio emissions can be detected. They can attract immediate Russian retaliation. So large numbers of drones operating over the battlefield, able to observe closely what is going on, supplementing the various commercial drones and smaller drones that both sides have been using in large quantities. That ought to make it easier for the Russians to get an even clearer view of the battle and also hunt for these HIMARS systems. Because especially if these drones are equipped with missiles, missiles have been developed by the Russians for their drones, then of course if they find a HIMARS system, they can attack it. And that would be a way of putting HIMARS systems out of action. So I suspect that over the next few weeks, we're going to be seeing increasing amounts of developments. We're going to see the Russians working to get on top of whatever problem the HIMARS systems represents. maybe those claims that were made by Stelkov were a bit exaggerated. But, eventually the Russians should be able to piece a good picture of the battlefield, and that make it more difficult for the HIMARS systems to operate. Now, why is this important? I think it's important for one very simple reason. We're getting reports. I read a report in the Financial Times that though the United States has so far supplied Ukraine with just apparently, some reports say up to 18 HIMARS systems. They may not all have been deployed, but anyway, that's the total number of HIMARS and perhaps multiple rocket launch systems like the M270, which is a related system. Whilst the number of these systems that has been deployed is relatively small, the United States has committed a third of its stockpile of missiles for its HIMARS systems, said to be around 25,000 in total, which would mean perhaps around 8,000 missiles, that it's committed 8,000 of these missiles for Ukraine. Now that seems astonishing, and it does suggest that whoever is planning all of this in Kiev and in the Pentagon and Washington is now hoping that a powerful force of HIMARS systems will somehow be decisive in this offensive that Ukraine is planning to launch in southern Ukraine. Now, I don't think this is remotely going to work. As I said, I think the Russians will rapidly be able to get on top of this. And though 8,000 missiles sounds like a lot of missiles, please remember that Ukraine, by its own account, launches around 5,000 to 6,000 shells a day, and Russia 50,000 to 70,000 a day. So relative to the scale of this war, 8,000 is perhaps not quite as many as it appears. But anyway, this, it seems to me, is going to be the major shot. Create a force of HIMARS systems, use them to support a Ukrainian offensive in southern Donbass, in southern Ukraine, try to regain territory there before the winter closes in. There's going to be logistical problems. There's also going to be other problems, because it's clear that Ukraine is now very short of armored vehicles, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. And that must work against Ukraine in the event of an offensive, given how dense Russian artillery concentrations can be. But again, given the power of Russian artillery, that perhaps explains the reliance on the HIMARS. You need the HIMARS to deal with the Russian artillery so that your infantry, which is perhaps not going to be heavily armoured, can somehow fight its way through. If the Russians are intercepting the missiles, if they're tracking down the HIMARS systems with their drones, well, then that whole offensive falls apart even before it even begins. Now, I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen. I'm not saying that this offensive has any realistic prospects anyway. I have to say that the consistent pattern of this war is that whenever Ukraine has attempted an offensive, it has always ended badly for Ukraine. The offensive has always been thrown back. And I would also say that it does seem astonishing, and to me almost beyond comprehension, that Ukraine and the West have been talking about this offensive for months, so that the Russians, of course, are fully informed about it. And bear in mind that the Russians now have all their logistics in this area fairly well organized. I mean, they have a major logistics hub in Crimea, And of course, as I discussed recently in a recent program, they have rebuilt all the rail and road links from Western Russia to Crimea, using the land corridor that they've now gained through the fall of Mariupol and other such places. So the Russians can send weapon systems, tanks, men, materials to counter any offensive, and that may not be quite as difficult as people perhaps think. So that's what I wanted to say about the HIMARS. Now, I said that there were two reasons why Jake Sullivan perhaps had floated this bizarre story about Iran supplying all these HIMARS. I think one is supplying Russia with all these drones. One, as I said, is that I think that Sullivan is aware, probably, that the Russians are shortly going to be cranking out much larger quantities of drones than they have been using, or bigger, more powerful drones than they have been using in this war up to now. And I think he wants some sort of explanation of this, given that admitting that it's the Russians producing all these drones is embarrassing because it argues against the effectiveness of the sanctions. So why not blame Iran, which the United States anyway is in major conflict with? So that's one reason. The second reason is, of course, that there is the diplomacy. President Biden is about to visit Saudi Arabia. He's about to have talks with the Saudi leadership. He wants to win Saudi Arabia back towards a stronger commitment with the United States. And Saudis have been cooling on the US relationship for some time. So this is a good opportunity for Biden and for Sullivan to say, look, the Russians and the Iranians are best of chums. President Putin is just about to visit Tehran, which as a matter of fact he is. I'll come to that in a moment. And the Iranians, your deadly enemy, are busy supplying the Russians with drones. So you should really be siding with us, because you can see that far from the Russians being your friends, they're really the friends of your enemy, which is Iran. Now, I don't think the Saudis are going to be taken in by this for one moment, and I think the Russians will be telling the Saudis that there is absolutely no truth to this story. And I would add further that though Putin is indeed visiting Tehran, where he will undoubtedly be holding talks with the Iranian leadership, he's also going to be meeting one other very important person there who's not Iranian at all, and that is President Erdogan of Turkey. The reason Putin is going to Tehran is because there's due to be a meeting of the so-called Astana Group, which is Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And they came together back in 2017 to discuss an overall settlement of the conflict in Syria. So that's the reason Putin is there. And given all that's been going on in Syria, given the fact that the Turks have been talking about a major incursion into Syria, it hasn't yet happened, but given that there's been much discussion about this, it's completely understandable that the Russians, the Saudis, and the Iranians should be holding a top-level summit to discuss the Syrian situation between them. And it's also completely unsurprising that this would result in a trip by Putin to Tehran in order to conduct a meeting with these leaders in person, rather than through some virtual format, which is anyway more artificial, and which, of course, let's face it, is always conceivably vulnerable to monitoring and interception by a hostile third party. So that's the true reason, it seems to me, why Putin is going to Tehran. He's not going there hawking for drones or intending to forge some kind of alliance with the Iranians against the Saudis or anything like that. He's going there in order to discuss with the Iranian leadership and with Erdogan the situation in Syria. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean that Putin and the Iranians aren't going to have an awful lot to say to each other, and no doubt there'll be many discussions, given that a topic which I've not been discussing on this channel, but which certainly merits discussion. It looks as if the United States government, the Biden administration, has finally and irrevocably turned its back on rejoining the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal negotiated by Obama in the last years of his presidency, which put limits on Iran's enrichment of uranium enrichment program. So that collapse of the JCPOA and talk of possible war between Israel and Iran is certainly a topic that Putin will want to discuss with the Iranians because, of course, of the enormous geopolitical implications that it may have. Anyway, there we are. Let me just carry out a brief summary. Firstly, remorseless, relentless Russian advance in Donbass. Secondly, heaps of speculation about a Ukrainian offensive in southern Ukraine against Kherson and in Zaporozhye region. Thirdly, my own skepticism about the million-man army idea. I think this is a phantom, actually, but clear signs that Ukraine is now resorting to increasingly desperate methods in order to conscript men and women for its forces, almost certainly a sign of the staggering losses it is suffering. Next, a couple of points about the HIMARS. They're clearly effective, but perhaps not quite as effective as some reports suggest. And we're starting to see some indications of how the Russians might be intending to deal with them. Next, clear signs that the entire Ukrainian offensive in southern Ukraine hinges to a dangerous degree on the successful use of these weapons. If the HIMARS fails, the offensive probably will fail too. And last but not least, a very strange story about Iranian drones. Now, which I, like the moon of Alabama, I think is another piece of mythology that originates from the fertile mind of Jake Sullivan. Now, what I'm going to just finish by saying on the subject of the drones is that I said that it would be embarrassing for the United States to admit that the sanctions, the high technology sanctions, are not slowing down Russian production of high technology weapons, including drones. On the contrary, these weapons are accelerating. Well, the production of these weapons appears to be accelerating. Well, we are now starting to get more information about the cumulative performance of the Russian economy this year. And we've had some information both from the economics ministry in Russia and from the central bank. And that suggests that the GDP contraction overall up to now has been around 4%. Now, that may sound like a lot, but bear in mind that at the start of the year, people were talking about a 15% GDP contraction. Well, 4% is obviously a lot less than 15%. Moreover, the central bank seems to be suggesting that things are now flattening out. And there's even some hints that we might start to see some kind of production recovery in the later half of this year. Well, all I would say is that if all of this is true, then the sanctions have not only failed, but they have unequivocally failed They have certainly knocked out and failed to knock out Russia. They've changed much of the orientation of its economy. But it would seem overall as if the Russian economy is shrugging the sanctions off, even as in the West we're facing an inflation crisis and a recession, both at the same time. Well, there we are. Economic figures from Russia still very tentative. Picture may change from one day to the next. I would say that the ruble has again been trading at less than 60 to the dollar. It's been about 58 to the dollar over most of today, compared with 67 to the dollar, which it hit about a week ago. So that gives you a sense of how volatile this whole situation continues to be. So we mustn't assume that everything in Russia is rock solid and stable, because it clearly isn't. There's still a lot of uncertainty as to how things may work out. But certainly inflation seems to be falling there, production seems to be rising there, and the GDP contraction has so far been contained. Whereas in the West, well, we've discussed this in many programs, prices are rising, inflation is still rising, there's a major cost of living crisis, and there's now talk about a serious recession on the horizon. I think that's enough for me today. I've spoken for 56 plus minutes. Remember what I said at the start of this program, that especially in the light of what I said at the start of this program, it might be a good idea for you to join us, especially on locals. It's a simple thing to do. You only pay a small amount, you subscribe, and that's it. You don't have to do anything more. You get all the notifications you need. You can watch our programs. You can publish your own exclusive content. You can follow the exclusive content that we are publishing. So you can join us on locals. Join us on other platforms. Rumble, which is a connection to locals, being an obvious one. There's Super U, there's ODYSEE, there's also, of course, Telegram. And our Telegram channel is something which we're also seeking to develop very actively. And you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy all the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and also to tick the like button. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.